I'd like to believe that everyone is now seated and we are all back from the tea break. Okay. My name is Diabo Seto. I am your moderator for this session. I am a business reporter, a senior business reporter for the South African Broadcasting Corporation, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session for you. Without wasting any more time, I'd like to call up the panelists for this session to come to the front and be seated in front of us. Firstly, Mr. Tsietsi Mokgele, who's the Executive Chairman and Director of Elecom Global South Africa. Sir, could you please come to the stage? Mr. Mokgele is coming up. Mr. Kevin Ramkolwan, he's the Chief Executive Officer for Business Mauritius. Sir, please take a seat. Dr. Bernard Monai, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. You are the Head of Program for Business Administration for the University of Seychelles in Seychelles. Dr. Bernard is coming up. Mr. George Kararaj, he's the AFDB Lead Economist. Sir, could you please come forward? You may go behind me, it's okay. And lastly, Dr. Danjay Juri, he's the Vice Chancellor for the University of Mauritius. Sir, could you please join us on the stage? Thank you, gentlemen. I must fine UNECA, Dr. Adejanobi, for not having any women on this panelist. I'm disappointed. I will read out, firstly, all the bios of our panelists today, just so that you are familiar and know who they are, why they are in front of us, and what they will be sharing with us. As beautiful as I look, I'm very strict with time. As they stand here, I am going to ask them. As they stand here, I am going to ask them to limit their presentations to 5 minutes. We are in Mauritius after all, and there's a sea waiting for us outside. I will start with Commander Tsietsi Mokgele. I will briefly read out his bio to you so that you understand why he's important and why he is worth listening to today. Mr. Mokgele is from Elecom Global. This is a maritime and ocean industry advisory company, and he also sits on other boards as well. He's also the former CEO of the South African Maritime Safety Authority, SAMSA. He held that position from 2008 until 2016, and I see now that he's playing for the other side, so he's the moneymaker here. His experience is also in the ocean economy or the Operation Pakisa, and he has led the African Oceans Economy initiatives, including the African Integrated Maritime Strategy 2015. Through his extensive global network of relationships in the maritime and ocean industry sector, he leveraged high-value marine transportation, investment opportunities in the South African and African markets in pursuit of his passion of ensuring the spread and growth of South Africa's maritime ocean industry. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is someone that understands waters very, very much. Next is Mr. Kevin Ramkolwan. I will read out your bio, sir. You are the Chief Executive Officer for Business Mauritius, the apex private sector organization on private and public sector dialogue and industrial relations. You were the former director of the Mauritius Tourism Promotion Authority, the National Tourism Promotion Authority of Mauritius, and the Director of New Business Development at the former Board of Investment, as well as the National Investment Promotion Agency. That's, you've been around. And you've also been awarded both the State of Scholarship of Mauritius and the US Fulbright. You also hold a postgraduate degree from Cambridge University in the UK and the University of Maine in US. Welcome, sir. Dr. Bernard Monenay, you were born in Seychelles, and you have lectured, also headed a school in Seychelles Polytechnic. After completing your studies in business administration, you have pursued a business management career and worked over 5 years in the private sector. In 2007, you returned to education as the Training and Development Manager of the Seychelles Institute of Management, and 2 years later, you were part of the team of the University of Seychelles. You obviously have a doctorate, and you are currently leading the undergraduate programs and the Senate Research as well as Innovative Committee of the University of Seychelles. Mr. Kararaj, you are the lead economist for the African Development Bank. You've been recently an Economic Affairs Officer for the Macroeconomic Division for UNECA. You hold a PhD in Economics from Leeds University. You have published on public policy, macroeconomic policy, political limits of reform programs in developing countries, and also you have experience in development in Africa, also focusing on the lens of MDGs, structural change in Africa, rethinking development in the 21st century, and so forth. Welcome, sir. And lastly, Professor Jury, you hold the post of the Vice Chancellor of the University of Mauritius since last year in March, I see. You have previously held the post of National Research for biomaterials and drug delivery under the Mauritius Research Council from 2012 to 2016. You have studied in France. That's where you received your PhD. You have worked on sucrose-based polymers for your PhD. You have received various national, international awards and recognition, including the first Best Mauritian Scientist Award in 2011. And you are also an elected member of the Association of Commonwealth University since July last year. I chose to summarize that. You're welcome, sir. Without wasting any more time, Mr. Mkhele, can I ask you to please make your brief presentation, sir? 5 minutes is all I'm giving you.
Good morning to all of us. I've been pre-warned on time, so I need to keep the watch in front of me, lest I be the first one to suffer the eye of our facilitator. Yes, I think on the issue of the first question that's been posed that I'm to respond to, which really is the role of the public sector in the exploitation of the opportunities that are present in the oceans economy. Firstly, I think the issues, I'll just point to 3 specific areas that I want to engage on. Firstly, is to confirm that the business case has been made. I think if there's anything UNECA can take home out of this session, is that it has put forward a convincing case that oceans economy is open for business. As for the bringing in of the private sector, there's just 1 or 2 issues that I want to put forward. The first one is the early stage engagement of the private sector. One of the issues that delay implementation is to run and run very, very hard and run far, and only thereafter invite in partners with whom you need to execute and ensure success of the program. So as we know that the size of the African private sector in the oceans economy space is not that big, because most nations grew out of the port industries and they expanded the supply chain and they went on to do other things. So that's going to be the first issue that we need to deal with, of having more and more and more engagements involving private sector in the leadership position, not for them to respond, but for them to co-create the oceans economy for the continent. The other issue I want to point out on the private sector itself and ensuring their participation is that private sector needs to play to what is its unique contribution to the success of the oceans economy. And that includes private sector being in to engage on issues of mobilization of capital, both mobilization and movement of capital across the continent into industries, sectors, and companies, so that we have a network of ocean industry players. The other thing that private sector needs to focus on is that we are entering the oceans economy space at a time when there are tectonic changes that are taking place, driven largely by innovation and technology. It cannot be business as we knew it 20 years ago. And it is a well-established fact that private sector has got the flexibility, the ability to respond fast, engage and change as times go. The biggest issue that the public sector is suffering at the moment, the regulators in particular, is that the speed of change is such that the public sector is not catching up. And therefore, the one role that the private sector needs to bring in is its innovativeness and its ability to move and move fast, but doing so in consultation and in partnership with the public sector, with civil society, particularly academia and research. And lastly, perhaps on the what should bring in public sector, private sector in, is in Africa, it's unlike any other market. Others can talk about sustainability inclusive of society, but the burden on businesses in Africa is that you have to carry society with. And by turning that into an advantage, I think we have an expanded concept of business where we don't have an oceans economy that's not responsive to societal changes. So the other question was, what are the specific activities for involvement of the private sector in the oceans economy? I think firstly, I've given the unique contribution private sector might make. By bringing private sector early, it means that they become part of the solution design. If you design a solution, you are likely to commit, you are likely to ensure success. And they must also be present at project initiation. In the economies of the past, you could initiate, go mobilize, engage, and deliver. But today, we need to co-create the oceans economy so that we can move fast. I'll be quick on just pointing out on the funding and finance. I'm sure our colleagues from the Development Bank will deal with that issue. Skills mobilization, technology, but most importantly, leadership. It worries me when private sector sits back and points at issues that the state should have done, the public sector should have done, must do, and cannot do. The truth of today's economy is that the divide is not there for winning nations. Winning nations, they win because they hunt as a pack. There's no divide between private and public. It's a chain, and that chain has to pull together. Just in the 1 minute that I'm left with, I want to point out to various areas that I think private sector should engage itself more. Ports are an area where most of our countries have closed out the private sector. And public sector tries through SOEs to do everything that is to be done inside ports. But ports are no more nodes of loading and offloading anymore. They are part of a much longer value chain, and therefore private sector has to find its way into shipping ports and logistics to support its own supply chains in and out of markets. The second area that we need to provide is production and manufacturing, including construction of civil infrastructure in the ports. For too long, this has been an SOE role, and yet we know that the lower capacity of our SOEs mean that they need to open themselves up on the construction of ports and marine infrastructure to private sector play. I just want to close on just two quick ones in this regard, that the only way that private sector can come in and play is not as companies, but is as a value chain. And that value chain has to run through two main pillars. We need to facilitate the clustering around areas of specialization by regions of the continent, and we also need to set up hubs. And I think in the discussion, we'll come to the areas of why that would work. No single company can pull up and succeed and enter global value chains today unless it is based on a very strong hub or belongs to a very, very competent and efficient cluster. And the clustering concept is something we need to come back to so that we can be competitive globally. And I think these are some of the issues that I thought, and I wanted to put up front to say private sector has to provide the lead and leadership in the context of high-speed innovation, technological changes that we're going through, and just the geostrategic environment that we're living in. Companies cannot function by themselves. They can only function as part of coherent chains within the hubs, which are geographically located, and clusters, which ought to crisscross our continent. I thank you. Before I get kicked off the podium, and I'm sure we will engage as the day goes. Thank you.
I told you that I missed business. When I say 5 minutes, I mean 5 minutes. Mr. Ramkalon, please come up. You are the CEO of Business Mauritius. If you could share your presentation with us, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning rather, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I guess what would be most interesting is the panel discussion afterwards when we can share experiences. So really my intervention is about situating the ocean economy and the role of the private sector in a larger, broader context. So maybe I won't take the 5 minutes that I am given, although maybe. It is important to firstly start defining the blue economy. Many definitions, international definitions exist, but for simplicity's sake, we're talking about the ocean resources, we're talking about services around the ocean, and we're also talking about coastal resources and services. So broadly, it would include traditional activities such as fishing, logistics, ports, etc., bunkering, but it would also include new services that we need to explore, get into. Biotech, marine biotech, for example. Ocean energy would be something else. And it includes some traditional coastal services such as tourism, which today represents for many coastal countries a very large share of their ocean economy. Now, engaging the private sector into the blue economy, into the ocean economy, really requires for us as private sector operators that a framework is defined. I think the fine line between mobilizing the private sector to invest and to develop the ocean economy and maybe what was said before, pushing, front-loading investors to do so. The fine line is in creating the right framework for those operations. And that framework includes the legal framework, the regulatory framework, and also the practical requirements for operations. And in our view, when we talk about such a framework, we need to look at the ocean resources and the ocean economic activities into 3 distinct categories and address them distinctly. Firstly, I would put in the mature sectors. So the fisheries, for example, would be clearly a mature sector. Port and logistics activities would also fall into the mature sector, as would tourism, coastal tourism, obviously. Then you've got the emerging sectors, those sectors that are perhaps already started on a pilot scale, or where you've got some success stories but which needs to be scaled up. In there you would find some biotech activities, some work around the seaweed, algae cultures, etc., and small-scale aquaculture, I think, or high-value-added aquaculture certainly falls in there. And finally, you've got the full potential of the ocean economy, perhaps the sunrise industries of tomorrow, which today are completely new sectors, which many of them are still at a very much at a research and developmental innovation level. And there I would particularly be thinking of the ocean energy projects and some form of using carbon captures, ocean as carbon capture, etc. Many new sectors and probably many such activities that we are not yet aware of anyway. So how do we mobilize investors, the private sector, into those 3 different categories? I believe that the policy requirements, the policy direction have to be threefold. Investing is always about risk versus returns. Right? It's not magic. For mature sectors, really the idea of being able to manage these risks. The returns are well known in mature sectors. It is all about managing risks. So therefore, a stress on compliance is extremely important, creating legal frameworks that enable operators to work in parameters that are well structured, but can be moved if it's backed by science and facts. Very often in mature sectors, what is stopping growth is that we err perhaps too much on the side of caution. It's very important to err on the side of caution when you're talking about the environment. But if you're backed by significant data, if you're backed by science, then you can expand those parameters. And that's probably the next wave of development for the mature sectors. Maybe let me give you some ideas. Today we are, maybe in Mauritius, we are very keen to develop aquaculture as a new sector of the ocean economy. Yet we have different forces, it's conflicting use of the resource, so we have different sectors, the different users that are trying to find their own bearings in the developments of those new sectors. And if we err on the side of caution, we will protect the environment. But if we're able to back those developments by scientific facts, you're then able to take the right decisions. Obviously protecting the environment, but being able to also move forward. We have the same issue when it comes to artificial islands. Mauritius is an island state. We are very good at tourism. I used to be the previous director of the tourism board. But we are not able to move into new projects such as artificial islands because we are not aware, or we don't have perhaps localized scientific data, or maybe my colleague later on will tell us what is happening there in terms of research, but we need such research to be able to move forward in such developments. Now, that is for the mature sectors. It also applies for the other sectors as well. For the emerging sectors, I would really put the most important point on emerging sectors is about facilitation, to be able to have a process where you can move into the sectors of the ocean economy. And for that, you need to have flexible laws, such as sandbox regulation is a new type of regulation that has been put in place in Mauritius, which we believe has a real potential for development, so that you're able, if you're not able to say what can be done, at least you're able to say what shouldn't be done or in what parameters those projects should be developed. And the sandbox regulation enables you to filter the negatives and ensure that projects that are positive, but which are so perhaps advanced that you're not able as government to regulate properly, you at least have created the pathway for its development. And when it comes to new sectors, there's again no magical formula. If it's a new sector, if it's at the frontier of research and entrepreneurship and innovation, private sector would certainly invest, but to invest, when you think of the risk versus return of an investor, we wouldn't as a country see perhaps more investments going into the sectors where the returns are extremely predictable and the risks are more or less zero. So that is why in some countries, in some places, you see a lot of money flowing in, but all of it going into a specific sector because it's low risk and high return, or at least very predictable returns. But if we want the private sector to invest in those new sectors of the economy, which can become the next sunrise industries for our different countries, then we need to put in place the necessary mechanism to be able to manage that risk section. Therefore, we need to put in place policies which favor R&D, policies which favor innovation and entrepreneurship. And that, I think Mauritius is learning how to do it. We've been trying to do it for many years, but nowadays in Mauritius there's a new program, there's a new type of self-regulating activity, which is a matching grant between the private and public sector to develop innovative new projects, which perhaps somewhere there would lie the key for the development of new sectors. My friend before talked about the global supply chains. For countries like Mauritius and for countries in Africa to be able to really successfully develop the ocean states, the idea of getting our private sectors into the global supply chain is extremely important. If we are not able to become regional or international players, no industry will be able to put in the investments and the trainings and the infrastructure to develop large scale. Finally, that leads me to my final point, which is about regional linkages. To be able to do that, I believe as Africa, as a continent, we are each, well, many of us, we have got some giants like Nigeria or maybe South Africa, but for the rest of us, it is extremely important to build more and more on those regional linkages. That is why the earlier presentation on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is extremely important. More and more for the ocean economy, we need to build those linkages and be able to add value at different stages and different geographical locations to bring our products into the regional and international market. And with that, the final word is speed to market, whether it's in terms of services. We talk more about speed for market for goods, but even for services, there is a necessity to bring ideas to fruition quite quickly. For goods, obviously, we know that it leads to better logistics for it to happen. On this note, I'll thank you and I'll take your questions later. Thank you.
Mr. Kevin, in my world, at this time, we would have gone to an ad break twice. In the TV world, we would have gone to an ad break twice. But thank you for your presentation, albeit it was longer than 5 minutes than what I asked for. Next, we're going to have Dr. Monane. Won't you please come up to the stage and share with us how the private sector participation in the blue economy can help to address the challenges of poverty, youth unemployment, inequality that Southern Africa is faced with, sir. I'll give you 6 minutes.
Right, good morning. Based on the presentation so far, it would appear that the blue economy is not just a new concept, but it's also carries a lot of important challenges and opportunities as well. Now, although it does carry a lot of challenges based on earlier presentations, it would appear that there are also a number of success stories as well, including in the region and around the world as well. Now, one particular country with which I'm familiar with, of course, is Seychelles. We have heard that Seychelles and Mauritius, including a few other countries, have developed their blue economy sector quite importantly, or are progressing in that direction. Now, in Seychelles, for instance, we have been developing our blue ocean economy since the 1970s, so we have quite a bit of experience in that area. In fact, the ocean is our only capital. Our two main economic sectors are fisheries and tourism, and we have basically had no choice but to develop those sectors, which today are the top forex earners of the country. Now, how does the private sector contribute to that blue economy? The public sector simply creates the environment that facilitates the investment of private investors, basically. Now, government since the 1970s has invested a lot in infrastructural developments, both in terms of development of ports and services and the financial sector as well. And most of the industries now operating in those sectors of tourism and fisheries are private investors. Now, of late, the government is now placing far more importance on value adding. So a lot of investors are now being brought into developing value-adding industries. Now, those incentives include infrastructural developments, as I mentioned recently, just now. And for instance, there is now a plan to redevelop the ports, and incentives in terms of tax concessions have been created to attract investment in ecotourism projects. So this is how the private sector or the public sector can facilitate the investment of the public sector into blue economy. And no matter how the challenges are, irrespective of the big challenges that many countries in Southern Africa face, I think that there is a need for the public sector to become more of a facilitator of blue economy investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. Mr. Kararach, the AFDB lead economist, won't you please come up to the podium and share with us the role of national governments, regional economic communities, and what they can play, the role that they can play in supporting.
That's not
is
me.
this you? I beg your pardon. See, I almost gave you a whole new thing to do. Of course you could. Dr. Kararach will be talking about the financing instruments and mechanisms that exist to support the blue economy, as well as investments and activity from, obviously, the point of view of an economist.
And the bank.
And the bank.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope my presentation will be short enough to keep the interest and long enough to cover the details. Huh? And you can guess what I mean. But so let me start by saying that from the perspective of the bank, and in fact, if you look at the question, it actually implores us to have an holistic perception or attitude towards the blue economy. So what I'm going to talk about, I think, is an attempt to understand the ecosystem, the business ecosystem, and how the bank actually will relate to the private sector in that process. And then I can give you a sense of the kind of financing instruments and other activities that we support to actually ensure that this thing called the blue economy can actually come to benefit us as Africans in the broader context of poverty reduction and development. There were a number of issues that have been already raised, and I agree with from our perspective as the bank, we certainly see a wide range of role for the private sector, including, for example, the building of infrastructure, including things like clean energy, the management of water systems. We certainly think that the private sector has a very big role in crowding in finance, leveraging finance for investments, issues around research and development. But more importantly, also, we see a big role for the private sector in management of waste. And I think if you watch TV regularly, there's this big story about emissions into the oceans, plastics and things like that. So if you came to the bank and we are about a financial project, we would ask you for an environmental impact assessment before we can actually talk and move forward. So the issue of managing the environment is a big one, but we certainly think that the blue economy demands that we revamp our business model. So it cannot be business as usual. So there must be new instruments in that regard as well. We think that the private sector, and the first speaker talked about that, the importance of training and skill development. And I think these issues were raised yesterday as well. Equally important is the issue of the development of pipelines and financing arrangements. So we support work on public-private partnerships. Okay, so we can do the risking of projects to facilitate PPPs. So that is an important element, because without that, sometimes project gets stalled or development gets stalled because the issues of risk. So we do de-risking and we encourage PPPs. But we also think that the private sector should be a big player in policy dialogue and the design and implementation of any efforts towards the development of the blue economy. We also think that you can't operate, as I said, you must be part of a bigger business ecosystem, and the issue of regulation is an important one. And I think in many instances we employ self-regulation, but sometimes it does not work, so we work with government and the private sector in that regard to actually get the balance right on issues of regulation, so that we use the blue economy in a sustainable way. And equally important is on issues of governance. Here in governance is not just economic governance, but also corporate governance. Many of you might be aware that we lose billions in terms of illicit financial flows, kickbacks, and corruption. I think we try hard to ensure that we actually put these issues at the front. So in terms of what exactly would, to get this ecosystem right, what would exactly the bank be doing? The bank will be doing, or actually has been working in four broad areas. The first one is actually leveraging financing. And we are developing blue bonds. And I should invite you to come to Johannesburg in November. There's an Africa Investment Forum. If you flew SSA yesterday or this morning or the day before, we have taken a broadsheet advert to invite you to come to Johannesburg. And that will be happening between the 8th and the 9th of November. And it will be actually a dealing platform. So all you big private sector players, you're invited to Joburg in November. The other thing that we do, and I'm going to finish, is actually knowledge management. We think that we need to be developing a culture of learning. Okay, so you can't just do business as usual. You need to develop a culture of learning, and that requires what an earlier speaker mentioned on the issue of research and development and innovation. So innovation is not just in terms of new technologies, but also in terms of how you do business differently. So innovation in business systems. The third thing that we think we can do, and I was speaking to Saeed yesterday, is actually using our convening power, crowding political will and action. And we spoke about a couple of things that we could do together, including some knowledge products that we can work on. And that would be important in terms of, how do we design new incentive systems? How do we work on the issue of regional integration? How do we make sure that innovation systems are the kind of innovations that actually foster the beneficiation of the blue economy? How do we develop institutions that actually make these new concept actually functional? And more importantly, we Africans are great at developing blueprints, but we kind of fall short on implementation. How do we ensure that actually we have implementation mechanisms that actually work? And then finally, the importance of nurturing change. Somebody talked about we should learn not to do business as usual. But I think that is really an important one. And in the context of the issue of poverty reduction, sustainable development, issues around exclusion of women is quite important. So gender mainstreaming green/blue growth, issues of inclusion, issues of developing champions and leadership becomes critical. But let me just give you two examples. Here in Mauritius, we have actually put $1 million from the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa to develop deep ocean water application. So this is concrete money that the Mauritians can testify to. And we are also developing, and we've just approved actually, it has been listed on the Mauritian Stock Exchange, and you can confirm what they call the Africa Bond Fund. It was just listed, I think, about a month ago. And so in terms of the financing instruments, there are quite a range of instruments with great emphasis on de-risking, but we also are very happy to actually work with project promoters to develop new financing instruments. Beyond that, we do work, as I said, on knowledge, and we facilitate dialogue, so to speak. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost there. Our last speaker is Dr. Danjay Jury. To get this correct, he is going to share with us what the role of universities and research institutions can play in addressing capacity and deficiencies in the blue economy. And I believe on top of that, he can also speak on the role of national government, governance and regional communities in playing or supporting the private sector development. Since you are my last speaker, I'll give you 7 minutes.
Plus 2 topics.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I thought I had 10 minutes, so I'm being given 7 minutes, so that's fine. Good morning to you all. Just happy to be here. And I'll try to not only summarize, but try to add on a few things that the previous panelists have already touched on. The first thing I would like to say is we all know the challenges that we face for the development of this blue economy. People before me talked on the problems that we face, the challenges, the market, the scale, the environment, climate change, human resource development, technology development capacity. Those are the challenges. Now, when we look at the challenges, we need to also add one more element to that. We did not refer at all to the SDG 14, which is about the sustainable development of the oceans. That is add one more difficulty to the development of the oceans, to that blue economy that we're all referring to. So how do we do that? People have just said it's not business as usual. Now, the question I ask myself is, are African countries ready, or are African countries have enough experience in the development of innovation using the triple helix? In other words, getting industry to work closely with the public sector and with the universities. Why do we need that? Because we can refer to the low-hanging fruits. We can say, well, let's go to fisheries. That's easy, right? But the issue is no more about just fisheries. It's more about also other knowledge-based industries. So how do we do that? Do we have experience into driving, into working closely with industry? How do we situate clearly the needs or the inputs of each of them? Just simply to put it, from my perspective, I would see the public sector as bringing in the necessary ecosystem and responsible for the development of the human capital. The universities would join in providing the necessary intellectual capital, and the private sector would bring in the business capital that we need for such industry to be able to sort of flourish. Now, the other issue that I want to raise also is, have we clearly set our priorities? When we talk of the blue economy, I don't think there is a kind of recipe that we have to follow. Because each country, I was looking at the stats, and I could see that in the whole of the Indian Ocean rim, we've got countries listed from, I think, 13th place in terms of GDP to 124, 125, 125th place. So we've got a range of countries, and we cannot have a recipe for all the countries. We need to reflect on each country's priorities. I think that's very important. And when we say that, we come to the immediate conclusion. So each country has got to define its priorities. What are the priorities? If we look at Mauritius, we are, I think, at 13% in terms of export of, in terms of fisheries exports. I think we have room to improve. We can go further than that. But what about the other industries, like, for example, development of aquaculture, or other areas where we could add value? So I think that we need very clearly to look at our priorities and the status of the country. We talk about knowledge-based industries. Are we able to support industries in terms of research? What are the infrastructure? What is the ecosystem we have in our country to support that? So we need to clearly reflect on that. Now, in terms of what other support we can provide that the government can provide or the regional community can provide, I think there is something important. We're in a world where there is open data sharing. Yet, what we find is that in our countries, we try to restrict. We're not willing to share information. I think it's very important that we share information with industry. In our country, for example, we have a number of cruises that are being organized. When I talk to industry, very few of them are aware of those things. Now, are we getting the information to industry? I think that's something very important. We are also looking at other ways to support industry in terms of, for example, human resource development. Would you know that at the University of Mauritius, we offer at present 6 undergraduate programs in the ocean field or in the marine field. We have 5 postgraduate programs. So in all, 11 programs are offered at the university. We offer also programs, short courses for industry. We offer programs in Rodrigue. I see one of the commissioners here present. We offer commission programs in Rodrigue. We work closely with industry. The government of Mauritius has put in place a very interesting funding scheme, which is called the CRIGS, the Collaborative Research and Innovation Grant Scheme, where we can partner with industry to develop innovative projects. Industry contributes 50%, and the Mauritius Research Council or the government contributes the other 50%. So that allows us to develop real projects that would impact. And the term impact is very important. Whenever we do research, we do not need blue sky research. We need research that can impact on the community, research that can impact on industry. I think that's also very important. At the university, we are championing not only a research-engaged university, but we're also championing entrepreneurial activities. So we're setting up, for example, incubators at the university. At present, we are working very hard, and government has funded, in part, the setting up of an agri-tech park at the university, where we're inviting industry to come and build projects with us at the university. And on that park, we are planning to mount a specialized marine lab. So I think this is something very important. And when I talk of research, I think it's also very important that African countries reflect on putting up consortia of research organizations or universities that can work together. Somebody before me said that no country on its own can tackle such big, ambitious projects. We need to work together. We need to build consortia. And I think this is the way forward. And this has to be integrated into the funding agencies, into the banks also, looking at developing the necessary intellectual capital that we can unleash to really deliver in that sector. I would also touch on the exploitation of the resources. We talk a lot of marine biotechnology, we talk a lot of pharmaceuticals and so on, but we need also to be aware that those are industries that are not going to emerge in the short or medium term. We're talking of industries that are 10 years ahead of us. So the planning starts now. If we are to really believe in pharmaceutical industries, it should not be just a buzzword that all of a sudden we'll develop a pharmaceutical industry exploiting our marine resources. These are long-term vision. So I think I talked about the industry collaborations. I talked about incubators that we're setting up. I talked about the research projects that should be more of a regional nature. I talked about the programs that we're delivering. I missed one important point. At present, at the university, we have 30 PhD students working on their PhD thesis in the field of marine sciences and biotechnology, marine biotechnology. We cover not only aquaculture, marine biodiversity, marine technology, coral bleaching, coral reef conservation, geomatics, ICZM, integrated coastal zone management, marine pollution. Those are all areas where our students are currently engaged. One very important point is that we cannot do anything. Industry, public sector, university, the three are very important to work together. But if we do not think of the community, engaging the community, we'll reach nowhere. I think that's very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. At this point, please allow me to invite you to engage along with me to ask our panelists whatever questions that you think might be useful to you. They had very insightful nuggets to share with us. But first, please allow me to pose the first question to Mr. Mkhele. As a person that has been in both sides, you were part of a state-owned enterprise, and now you have gone into the private sector. What important lessons can you share with those who are still in government about how they can enable the private sector to play a meaningful role in trying to develop the blue economy or the oceans economy?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think there are maybe about three quick ones that are issues that make a difference. The first one is to view government as sitting in a leadership position, as a custodian of the interest of people in that country. And therefore, anyone holding a public service position is actually holding a leadership position. So insofar as the oceans economy is concerned, when there was an opportunity to do something in that space, you could not become an impediment, you could not become somebody to react or respond. You needed to take the initiative that aligns with the leadership position that you have. You have access to the political leadership in the country, you have access to any existing institution, you have access to global networks. That's the first issue. Take leadership and lead. The second thing that we did differently at SAMSA, originally when I took over, SAMSA was actually a maritime safety authority. And we had many, many fights around that issue. I said, as the only existing apex maritime authority in the country, it has to deal with issues of national interest, of economic growth, of inclusive society. And therefore, SAMSA became a single door to the entirety of the public sector, where you didn't need to go to 12, 13, 15 ministries. If you came to the door of this one agency, on our own, we reached out to the rest of government and the rest of society on behalf of the private sector. I'll give an example. When we were starting the OPL, the off-port limits bunkering facility, and I'm sure Mauritius, I know, is very aspirational in that regard. We did it in 2 years. The lead was SAMSA because we understood there's an opportunity for an off-port limits bunkering facility. But the private sector was very skeptical because they've tried many times before. We did the groundwork, we did the business case, and we threw it up in the air. Whoever catches first can come and engage whole of government. By the time they came from licensing to operating, it all happened within 18 months. So an SOE or an agency can become a single door into the rest of government. And the last one is service to society. Inclusiveness on our continent is a force multiplier. And I just want to do the numbers very quickly on this issue. By exclusion of women participation in the economy, we lose 50% of the human capital that we have. So that 1.2 billion means absolutely nothing. It gets reduced to 600 million. By excluding young people on the continent, 60% of the 600 million you're losing another 240 million people. So we were playing in the game of diminishing returns. And by the time you come to the all-male, above 30-year-olds in the economy, you still stand to lose about 20% out of retirement. So in all, we are not a 1.2 billion people economy. We are still a 200 million economically active people on the continent. And therefore, the duty of not only public sector, but private sector, is that in Africa, education and knowledge management in total must become a major investment area and not an expenditure area. So by doing all these three things, I truly believe that we can have a public sector that is proactive, that provides leadership, but that also understands its own ecosystem insofar as building an inclusive, industrialized economy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I see that you've touched Professor Jury there when you talk about education and the spend of education when it comes to oceans economy. With a show of hands, ladies and gentlemen, do I have any questions from the floor? Anyone who would like to engage our panel? Do we have roving mics? Mr. Mhlanga, do we have roving mics? Okay. Oh, we've got mics on the desks. Dr. Ngomo, I think I saw you with your hand up. Anybody next after him? Tanzania. Ma'am, you will be next. Thank you.
Chair, if you allow me, I will give the priority to the member state and I will go after.
You may go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is not the question, it's rather contribution. I think the success of this blue economy in Africa, we have to work hard to make sure that we engage our African private sector. When I say African private sector, I mean the local private sector. We have to use the value chain approach to start the various gaps available for our private sector to be able to meaningfully engage the blue economy and come up with a comprehensive strategy or an action plan which identifies various possible investment in every in mature sector or in what they refer at the emerging sector or SME sector, and clearly identify the possible investment areas which our African private sector can tap or be able to invest along those areas, because at the presentation, the presenters said there are various types of investment which some are more sophisticated for our private sector to be able to engage. Slowly will be engaging or engaging slowly within the global chain. But to start with, we have to come up with a clear, focused approach which can be able to make sure that the local private sector are able to integrate in the value chain along the blue economy. Thank you.
Dr. Bennett, would you like to maybe take over that and share your insights on, yes. It was a comment, you don't have anything to add to it, perhaps? Dr. Karaj?
Yeah, as I was saying, actually, I think that there is need to actually see that the so-called divide between the public sector and the private sector is to some extent artificial. So a reflection on an ecosystem which gives the role to every player, including communities, by the way. Communities, in many instances, get engaged in their own way of managing water bodies, for example. And so it's important to have that dialogue which includes every player. And as I said, the private sector should work in an environment, in an ecosystem where not just we facilitate business, but we also facilitate responsible business, particularly if you're talking about issues of sustainability. And that means, in some instances, government may need to put regulation, but not also regulation that becomes a burden. You can have a regulation that is actually facilitatory. And in that regard, you may encourage the private sector itself to develop mechanism for self-regulation. And I think that is important. And so the issue of corporate social responsibility, for example, should be brought to the fore. And the way we have historically exploited our resources has in many instances not been very optimal, and that you can talk about countries which have oil, for example, and still you find the level of poverty very high. You're on South Africa's diamond goal for kingdom come. You have been engaged in that, but the debate around issues of social inclusion continues. And so that tells me that there has been some breakdown in the framework for governance. And the numbers you have just given, reducing our population from 1.2 billion to 200,000 or something like that, that is actually quite telling, because we do not have systems that encourage optimal utilization of the resources that we have, including issues of dealing with youth unemployment and particularly graduate unemployment. It's not that we are not training people, but we are training people who actually do not get mainstream into the economy. And so the role of the private sector in revamping, for example, the education sector become critical. What kind of skills do we really need? And that should reflect the dynamics in the economy, which I think the private sector has a very critical role in pointing out that we need more engineers than historians. Not that we don't need to know history, but our needs may change with time as we go along. Thank you.
Mr. Ramkulan, before you answer that question, I don't know if Dr. Ngomo still wants to ask his question, but before he does, won't I ask you to please think about your share of, your members' share of corporate social investment. Dr. Kararach spoke about how much that is increasing annually to make sure that the communities are included in the diversification of the economies as we begin to make sure that economies are they are diversified and they play a critical role. But before you answer that, sir, may I ask Dr. Ngomo to please ask us a question?
Thank you, Chair. I will start by one observation, and after I will give my question. We all agree with two reality. One, the blue economy, the potential of the blue economy, the economic potential of blue economy is very huge, and it will need also huge investment. Two, we also agree that the Africa private sector is very small. So you have a small structure, small private sector. You have a huge potential for the blue economy. We need huge investment. So my first observation is how a small private sector, African small private sector, can really work and manage this huge reality. Now my question, what about the creation of a big regional public enterprise who start to give the chance for this market to start, and when it will start, they will be able to release piece by piece this market to the private sector. Because we know how the private sector work. They work on risk management, they work on capacity investment, on profit. So they are not here to plan strategy for 10 or 20 years. When you know that to start to make this economy, blue economy work, only a government, only a state can have this vision to say, okay, let's move on. So by having this regional business, but public enterprise, we'll have the chance to reinforce our integration and to make this market happen, to make this work, this business to start really to take off. So this is my question. What about public enterprise at the regional level, not at national level, regional level, working with, for some activity with private sector and gradually giving back this activity to private sector when they will be ready. We can also note that, if you can notice that the electricity have the same way at the beginning of our independence. It was not the private sector who drives the electrification of our countries. It was the government through a public enterprise. And later on now, you are opening the market to the private sector to start to generate electricity. So we can have the same approach. What the panelists think about this idea? Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, would anyone like to add on to that? Perhaps engage Dr. Ngoma? Mr. Ramkola?
I think a lot has been said with regards to this war. I wanted first, if I may, to answer just to add to the debate from what Madam from Tanzania has been saying before, and then perhaps on the CSR, and maybe that will touch a little bit further on integration and collaboration. Firstly, we talked about an action plan for investment in the ocean economy that the private sector could help develop for Tanzania. I really wanted to bring the debate to the idea of data and open data. Investments happen when you've got information on business opportunities. Companies, corporates today in Africa have a social responsibility. They work towards the betterment of the community, but at the end of the day, to be able to do business, you must see the returns and put your energy towards those returns. And that is where I wanted to just perhaps bring to this table the need for more open data. The need for more data firstly, and then more open data. Very often, and this is what we're trying to do in Mauritius right now, I must say, not just in the ocean economy, but more generally. Innovation in this country has come for the last years, mainly from embedded technologies that we import. There's a very interesting project, I think Professor Jerry mentioned it earlier, where we start to work together between the private sector, the universities, and government, particularly the research agencies, to develop new innovation. And the idea of the matching grant there ensures that there's no abuse of the process, but it's leading to something concrete. But when we look at the Mauritian experience so far in this project, what we see as the next step is to provide more data to our nation so that entrepreneurs, innovators can see the opportunities and go in. And it can be very simple data. If you've got 20,000 fishing boats that all use X amount of fiberglass, you have perhaps some smart startups that can bring changes to the process or to the technologies or to the materials used there. So data is key, and I think as a continent we're very poor. We have to face it. We're very poor on providing such data compared to the developed nations. It's obviously not seen as a priority yet, but as we move towards the need for more investments, more innovation on the ocean economy, we must realize that data will help us go there. And secondly, on that same point, I think what is extremely important to enable private enterprise to happen is to be able to create the frameworks, the legal and regulatory frameworks that give comfort to the private sector to go in. Very quickly, I'll go to your point on CSR. We have a rich experience of corporate social responsibility in Mauritius. Currently, the law tells us that every company mainly that makes a profit needs to give 2% to CSR activities. And we've now diverted parts of the fund to a national CSR initiative, out of which we've got some national priorities, which either the private sector can develop themselves or work at the level of the national committee to develop. But our experience here has been that the real value is when you're able to bring the managerial and the perhaps non-financial resources of the private sector into those national priorities as well. I'll give you a very simple example. Large companies in Mauritius have now identified in their own headquarters special zones for management of social projects. And because there's this interaction between the community and the managers of those large corporates who have at the back the HR resources, the full resources of those companies are able to really bring a change in their communities. For example, there are projects where old computers are refurbished. Old computers being used by those companies are now refurbished and given to those communities for the children to become computer literate. So there are many things that can happen if you're able to consolidate this linkage between companies and their communities. And obviously it's a win-win, because a healthy community also leads to the business working much better. Maybe a final point on this is when we look at CSR, when we look at national priorities from a public sector point of view, we are, because of the processes, we are very often looking at it in a silo perspective. So we'll work on education, we'll work on poverty alleviation, we'll work on finding jobs, on health. But what we found in our experience is that the need for cross-cutting projects also very important. However much you give education access opportunities to a poor, to family with children, if that family, on the other hand, is suffering from lack of food or health problems in the key breadwinner, that child's education is not at the same level. So it must be cross-cutting. Those are the 2 points I wanted to make.
Thank you very much.
You.
I see that, Doctor, you'd like to, you were nodding seriously there. I think you'd like to make a comment?
Thank you. Quickly, I'd just like to say a few things on this idea of that member from the African Union raised about having government taking the lead. My view is that if we are inspired by the Southeast Asian countries that have done very well, I'm talking of Taiwan, I'm talking of Korea, you will see, I'm talking of Singapore, of course, as well, you will see that this is not the role of government. And this is how these countries have really progressed. Government's role is not to do the marketing or the selling. I think the role of government is just to make sure that the right ecosystem is there, and this is the role of the private sector to take further, whether it's the blue economy, whether it's the digital economy, whatever. But this said, I think if we are to develop such new ideas, should we not then reflect in terms of an entrepreneurial nation? What does that mean? That means that government must be prepared to engage in risk sharing with the private sector. So this is not the case in most of the African countries. Our governments are very traditional in the way they will manage. And we're risk averse, right? Not at all engaged into risk sharing. So I think this idea of looking at an entrepreneurial nation and sharing risk is something that is very important to also take on board.
And just lastly, Dr. Bennett, can I ask you to just give us a few summary of the lessons that we can learn from Seychelles that has quite a developed industry in this regard?
Yes, indeed. I think the issue of public sector intervention, in a way, is it depends on the context. Because if you take the case of Seychelles, at the time of independence, we had a very small private sector. And without government intervention in the private sector, in fact, we would not be where we are today, middle-income country. So at the very beginning, if the economy is very small and there's a very small private sector, then perhaps government should be an active player as well. It all depends on the context, of course. You have to look at the context itself. And yes, there should be government intervention initially to facilitate to establish the environment, to create incentives for the private sector to come in, but then slowly move out of the private sector and let the private sector then create wealth. So yeah, government should play a role, but then it should gradually pull out of intervening in the market.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I've been alerted that it looks like our time together is over. But I do thank you for your rich insights into your various presentations. And I'm sure that people who would like to engage you personally are welcome to do so during break or during the course of this week. My name is Diabusito. I've been your moderator for this session. Thank you very much for giving me time and listening to me. And to our panelists, may I ask that we give them a round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I call this session to order. My name is Puaingosi Kininza from the Industrial Development Company of Eswatini. I am honored to moderate the session on land-locked and land-linked countries in and the blue economic sector. We will have 5 interventions, and I will read their biographies as they come up on stage, starting with Mr. Kaluba's bio, who has over 20 years' experience in the logistics sector, mainly in the terminal and port management, 15 years of which he has been with BP Zambia and BP Southern Africa. 5 years as CEO from Bulungu Harbour Corporation, Zambia. May we give him a hand as he takes his seat. The second panelist will be Mr. Ngubane, who is the CEO of Eswatini Railways. He has a Bachelor of Science, honors in engineering, a degree obtained from the University of Zimbabwe. He also has a master's degree in business administration. He has long experience in the transport sector, especially in the rail transport, which spans over 32 years. He has held senior positions at Eswatini Railways and a number of leadership positions in the Southern African Railways Association, SARA, and is a past president of the association. He is a passionate transport and logistics person who has significantly contributed towards the provision of quality transport services to Eswatini importers and exporters, including SADC countries whose goods go through Eswatini. Our next panelist is Mr. Smith, who is currently the CEO of Trans-Namibia, the national rail carrier of Namibia. He previously served as the CEO of the Walvis Bay Corridor Group. He has been leading the trade facilitation program in Namibia to develop Namibia as the logistics hub for the SADC region. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Yash Manik, who is the CEO of Mauritius Africa Fund Limited. He has been leading this fund since 2015 in furtherance of its African strategy. The government of Mauritius established this fund to spearhead Mauritian investment into the African continent through government-to-government frameworks. During his tenure, he has been instrumental to the execution of the special economic zones in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Madagascar in joint ventures with respect to leading the governments. Prior to joining Mauritius Africa Fund, he has been the project leader to Penn Bellin Associates, a leading market researcher and strategic consulting firm based in the United States of America. He is a graduate of Dartmouth College, a US Ivy League institution. And our last panelist is Professor Kulindwa, Associate Professor in Economics from the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. May we give him a hand as he comes up. Ladies and gentlemen, we will try and stick to the 5 minutes interventions, appreciating the fact that I will soon be competing with lunch, and I don't want to have an empty room while we are concluding our session. Without any further ado, I will call upon Mr. Ngubane, who will share with us on how landlocked and landlocked countries can engage or participate or do participate and engage in the blue economy. Over to you, Baba Ngubane.
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My brief presentation is going to address the question, how are landlocked and land-linked countries engaged or participate in the blue economy sector, either through inland waterways, transport corridors for goods and services, or even dry ports provision and management. Now, I liken transport and logistics to the central nervous system in your body, in our bodies, where everything or all messages from any part of the body are transported through to the brain or the spinal cord. I also liken the transport systems like red blood cells, which make sure that oxygen reaches every part or every cell in the body. I therefore say that when talking about the blue economy or economy in general, transport and logistics plays a vital role, because the value after producing a certain product or providing a certain services, it has to reach the market place, and also the production centers must receive various inputs from all over the world, because now it's a global, we're in international markets. Therefore, it's very, very important that landlocked countries, they also receive products from those countries along the coastline. So as we develop the blue economy, landlocked countries have a need for those services, for those goods, for those products, Therefore, it's important that the transport linkages between land-linked countries and those countries that are blessed with the oceans, there's efficient transport systems there. What we need as landlocked countries is that in the planning of in the ports development plans and harbors, and in actually in all the programs in improving the economy, the blue economy, is that we need access to the ports, and therefore we must be part of the planning equation. We must be part of the development, the joint development, so that we are able to inland, whatever we produce, whatever we need, is able to access the sea. There must be provision. Also, we need the coordination. It's very, very important when you are inland and you are transporting your exports or you want to receive your imports. The coordination, therefore, means that we don't want our goods to be staged or dwell too long in the ports. In fact, goods that are destined for inland, they must just be transshipped from the ships onto rail or road and into the landlocked country, the hinterland. The situation of packing things, of storing those goods, we know causes congestion, and that must be avoided in the ports. Therefore, we need to have service level agreements with those countries with ports and harbors who are developing the blue economy, which maybe it would be so exciting that they will then look at themselves how those facilities would serve them only. We believe that it is not just to serve them, they must always think of the hinterland, which are the landlocked countries. One of the models that have worked very well, now talking about Eswatini, is dry ports. Dry ports are simply ports that are inland. They are not like container terminals. There's a difference. Dry ports are seaports without the sea, without the water. So everything that you do at a dry port, which we have in Swaziland, we have had a dry port in Swaziland since 1993. And every year from that time, we have been growing in volume by 15%, to the point where we need much more, double the space to continue. This has brought a lot of value. How did we do this? We did this because we were working with the seaports, in this case Durban and Maputo, to actually, all cargo that we export from Swaziland is basically goes straight into the quay. There is no document processing either in Durban or Maputo, goes straight to the quay, loaded onto ships. The same thing with imports when brought in. I mention this because it's one way of actually linking more efficiently and cost effectively with the blue ocean economy for those countries with the coastlines. So I think, in fact, it was recognized by the United Nations, the development of dry ports, such that we are able to support. In Swaziland, being a small economy, they've been very competitive because of such a facility. The benefits have been low transport costs, low logistics costs, and obviously being providing the goods in overseas markets just in time. So this is the way that one looks at this, that the blue economy is for all of us, even those of us inland. And I think, again, running on the concept of integration, because integration is the future, and we have to integrate as much as possible. And I believe that the blue economy will integrate with what's happening inland, so that there can also be a benefit of products and services into landlocked countries, and what comes out of landlocked countries going through the ports, there must be a provision that we can also work together. But it starts from thinking and through joint planning, joint investments, integration. Don't do something where you are in isolation. Always think of us in the landlocked countries, and we believe, therefore, we will succeed together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ngubane. Our next intervention will come from Professor Kulindwa, who will share with us the investment and revenue generation opportunities for the private sector and the state through the blue economy by landlocked and land-linked countries. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Director. Good morning, everybody. I got this question this morning, and I just want to do like some of my students do. When you're given a question and don't think to, you can answer it, you make your own. So I have made my own question here, and I'll be answering that question. And this, in 5 minutes. And this question actually is focusing on the whole topic of the land-locked, land-linked countries and the blue economy. I'd like to also share with others who gave us the definition of what blue economy is since yesterday and today. I think it's important that we start with defining our terms so that we are on the same page when we talk about these issues. So I concur with the previous speaker who was on the earlier panel here with the definition of blue economy, as well as the two parts of what it entails, resources, but also activities which are done within the marine and aquatic spaces. Now, after that introduction then, we are looking at the blue economy and the potentials to be realized by the region, Africa. Here we are looking at the landlocked, land-linked. Essentially, this calls for integration. Integration of coastal nations, but also the hinterland countries. And it's not about what role the landlocked, land-linked countries alone, because they have to do it together. So when you do integration, and I also remember the initial presentation this morning, they touched about the free trade area in Africa. So creating the conducive, environment for African countries to work together. So it is important that we look at this in that frame. Okay, so we have to lay the conditions for integration. So we look at the potentials of our blue economy flowing not only to the coastal nations, but also to the hinterland. And how do we do that? The landlocked can remain landlocked, but they can also turn to be land-linked if there are necessary steps which are taken. And this is actually the way the coastal nations interact with the landlocked. So one of the aspects which I'm going to talk about is on the transit goods. Right now, that is what is happening. That's the relationship between the coastal countries, but also the landlocked countries. A lot of problems are being experienced right now by transporters across borders. And you would want that situation, to be minimized. And how do you do that? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The United Nations do have some instruments which can be used. And one of those instruments is the one which works on the customs processes. which makes the customs processes easier. Now, the International Transport Union, the TIER, the TIER International Road Transport, but also the International Road Union, have this arrangement whereby once countries enter this kind of arrangement, the time which they use to transport the goods from the harbors, to the hinterland and back to the harbors, that is export and import, is reduced very much. Some figures give a number like 57% and others up to 80% of the existing time for those countries which enter this kind of agreement. But also the costs. It reduces the cost to up to 38%, according to some research which has been done by the International Road Union. This is one aspect which can make the landlocked be land-linked. Otherwise, if you make it harder for goods and services to move from one country to the other, then this integration and the contribution of the land-linked countries to the blue economy would be very difficult. But the thing which I found out to my surprise is that the TIR has membership of 73 parties, and all these are in North America, Asia, and Europe, and none in Africa. I saw some information which talks to interest being shown by South Africa and I think some East African country, but we don't have a country which has membership there. And I'm wondering why such kind of an arrangement, which gives you all these benefits, we're not part of it. You won't tell me the time because I have a lot of things to. So the prerequisites which we have to get on the ground is to have some bilateral agreements in the integration, but also somebody talked about agreements in the ports, but shipping arrangements, fishing arrangements, and other resource exploitation arrangements, which will make the landlocked countries also contribute to the blue economy. Right now, blue economy is seen to be something which is for the coastal nations to enjoy. But definitely, landlocked, land-linked countries can contribute to the expansion of the blue economy by providing markets for goods in transit, but markets for goods which are being produced from the coastal. But at the same time, the landlocked, land-linked countries can also contribute to the expansion through also providing and supplying, goods and services, things like hydropower. They would have things like aquaculture, and I think there are some landlocked countries which are doing that. Zambia is having a lot of hydropower and exporting, I think it's linked to Tanzania. We also have Ethiopia, which has this huge hydropower project and is intending, to supply that to other countries. And this is a landlocked country. But apart from those, there's also responsibilities, and these are environmental aspects. Landlocked countries, which are in the hinterland, are very important in terms of conservation of the environment. Rainwater catchment areas, trying to reduce pollution. Somebody talked about mines polluting. That pollution in the rivers goes all the way to the oceans. So if the landlocked countries can also be part of the conservation the seas will also be safe. Thank you. So these are some of the things which the landlocked countries can contribute, but also what they can also get from the coastal areas. We heard some examples yesterday whereby Ethiopia, has taken part in the blue economy, although it's in the hinterland, by having, training, capacity, manpower, providing 500 seafarers, I think somebody gave us that number, and also having some business in the shipping area. This is a hinterland country. So there are all those opportunities which a landlocked country. Let me talk to the management or the governance. If we are looking at the benefits and the roles, the costs, we're actually not talking about the government doing it by itself. Somebody mentioned it here. The government has to come in at the beginning to create the conducive environment for things to happen. But essentially, this is a market thing. The private sector plays a lot of, plays a role in this one, and it has to be the one which pushes this. The government has a role there, and we have to give it a chance. But again, like my previous speaker said, it has to gradually, move away from the market and let, these guys work it. Some countries will win more than others, but also we have to look at the way we engage. Comparative advantage, competitive advantage could result in one benefiting more and another benefiting less. I'm not sure about the costs. The presentation in the morning talked about everybody wins in the free area. That's a model result, yes. And I was happy to hear about that. But definitely, there are some opportunity costs. The situation as it is now, somebody talked about it this morning again, that we have agreements, some bilateral, some multilateral. This is the situation right now. That's the landscape we are facing. But we have to take stock of this landscape and see, the possibility of us really benefiting. If a country has a 99-year-old agreement which takes away the control of these resources from us, definitely, we might not be in a position to benefit much. But also there is this aspect of Pareto optimality outcomes. Everybody wins, and nobody, benefits at the cost of others. And this has been a problem with integration, not in the African sense, but all over. And that's why these processes take a long time. And I think we have to be realistic and look into these matters so that when we want to integrate, we are actually addressing the real issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll wait for the questions.
Thank you very much, Prof. We will now invite Mr. Smith, who will share with us the prospects of engaging in cooperative agreements between land-linked and coastal countries in exploiting the benefits of the blue economy. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Maybe just to give a perspective, I should not be long because I'm challenged with time. More than 15 years ago, Namibia as a country, we started to develop the country as an alternative trade route for the SADC region. And at that time, of course, we didn't even know about the concept of blue economy. But what was important for us is really the extent to which we can create value for our country, but then also at the same time, value to the neighboring countries. And from that perspective, some of the initial initiatives that we have taken was really to sign cooperation agreements with the neighboring countries and to see how we can add value from a transport corridor perspective. Now, of course, this transport corridor initiative has then also provided better access and alternatives to the landlocked countries close to us. And with this approach, one of the initial agreements that also followed was the development of dry ports. My colleague has already spoken about the benefit of the dry ports, but what we have taken as a very strategic decision at that time is to provide dry ports to Botswana, Zambia, and Zimbabwe within the port of Walvis Bay. And through this, it has actually created more value. Now, what is important and how this is linked to the blue economy is really that the value chains is actually carried by transport routes. So this is the foundation in terms of how one should then create benefit in terms of the blue economy to the landlocked countries. We've also heard yesterday and today about the what countries like Ethiopia has done. Now, that I would say is very strategic in terms of the infrastructure development. So for any landlocked country to engage and to sort of multiply the benefit of blue economy is really to start looking at what sort of ownership can we buy into from the seaborne countries, which will allow us more benefit in terms of blue economy. Of course, some of the other benefits that one has to look at is really the reduction in terms of transportation cost, which would then make the landlocked countries also more competitive to set up manufacturing plants, etc., and therefore make different regions, for that matter, more competitive when it comes to competing with the international market. Because when you set up manufacturing plants today, it's not just competing within a region, it's basically competing from a global perspective. So the question is also for the landlocked countries to identify what are we good at, what are we better at in terms of creating value with respect to various value change. And it's also at the same time critical that one has to look from a landlocked country perspective, what sort of experience and knowledge do we have that's better, that can help us creating that advantage in the blue economy. And lastly, as I referred to earlier, is really to integrate that into your relevant economy is really about the control of ownership. It's about the partnership of resources in terms of looking at the future and how that then can create value over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Ladies and gentlemen, we will appreciate the fact that we have inland waterways within Africa. And at this point in time, I will invite Mr. Kaluba to come and share with us the experience of Tanganyika inland waterways and also the role that partners such as the international, regional, and national partners can play to support the development of the waterways. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Lake Tanganyika is host to at least 6 ports, 6 inland ports, namely Mpulungu, Kasanga, Kigoma, Bujumbura, Uvira, and Kalemi. Mpulungu is on the southern tip in Zambia. Kasanga and Kigoma are in Tanzania. Bujumbura is in Burundi. Uvira and Kalemi are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there are 4 countries that share Lake Tanganyika. That's Zambia, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi. By extension, cargo also goes to Rwanda, some of it to Uganda, and to South Sudan. The countries that share the lake need to cooperate to develop a policy framework for regulation of transport on the lake. There is need to comply with IMO SOLAS regulations just referring to safety of life at sea. There have been security issues arising mainly from conflicts in the DRC and Burundi, and to an extent, due to Rwandese involvement. Currently, cargo meant for Rwanda cannot go through the port of Bujumbura because the presidents of the 2 countries are not talking to each other. The common thread among all the ports along Lake Tanganyika is that they all have poor infrastructure, old handling equipment, there's lack of navigation aids on the lake, and a general lack of maritime skills. The Africa Development Bank has completed feasibility studies for the development of Mpulungu and Bujumbura ports. COMESA has contributed to trade facilitation for the Great Lakes region. We are able to export sugar from Zambia and Malawi to Rwanda due to the intervention on tariff barriers by COMESA. However, they still need to see more progress on the development of a single window port community systems, which will facilitate more efficient information flow and quicker flow of goods from one country to another. The World Bank has also commissioned some studies for the development of Kasanga Port. Kasanga Port is less than 40 kilometers from Mpulungu. And a railway leading to Kigoma. So there is a railway line from Dar es Salaam to Kigoma, which needs an upgrade. The challenge, as I said, is that Kasanga and Mpulungu are quite close to each other and only separated by national borders. Regrettably, the activities of the multilateral institutions don't give one the impression that they are talking to each other. So you'll have one project by Africa Development Bank on the lake. There's another project by Africa Development Bank, and the 2 projects don't seem to be talking to each other. The World Bank also has commissioned some studies on the lake, and so for the last few years, we've had a number of studies on the lake, but we are yet to see tangible development activity. There are opportunities for development of industrial clusters around Lake Tanganyika. Currently, we don't handle any containers on the lake, and yet that is what we need for safety of cargo that is traversing our respective countries. We can add value to the fish products that come out of the lake. We have big examples from Seychelles and Mauritius. The region also needs to come together to develop maritime skills. We're getting some support from the Dutch government for the development of a maritime school in Mpulungu. Our hope is that the school will have a national character so that it embraces the needs of the Democratic Republic of Congo, of Burundi, of Rwanda, and to an extent of Tanzania as well. We've got an offer for support also from Transnet, from the Transnet Academy in Durban. I know that there are discussions through PAMESA to engage Mauritius and Seychelles also to offer some support with maritime competences. There is a huge opportunity to develop the transport systems on the lake, including the vessels that are currently operating on the lake. We need to have ro-ro capacity. In other words, you need to have such capacity that even trucks, even vehicles can be carried on the lake. Currently, we don't have that. There is a big possibility to divert at least 300 trucks every month that are moving through Nakonde border from Tanzania and taking cargo to the Democratic Republic of Congo in Luapula province. That can only happen if we have capacity on the lake to move trucks across the lake. We also have agricultural activity growing around the lake. It is our firm belief that Zambia can contribute immensely to food security for the DRC, for Burundi, and for Rwanda. There are also opportunities for cruise tourism on the lake. We have a national park across the lake in an area called Nsumbu. Some of the most beautiful waterfalls in the southern region are in that area. I'm sure the audience only knows about Victoria Falls. There are equally other beautiful waterfalls in the northern circuit of our country. Bujumbura in Burundi also has very beautiful beaches along Lake Tanganyika. The international media has it that Bujumbura is unsafe because there is war. Actually, Bujumbura is active for very, very, very good nightlife, and the beaches are very, very good. Rwanda has a very good infrastructure. We know that we've got Rwandair now that is flying across the continent, is flying to other regions as well. We can take advantage of that to develop our tourism potential. I know also that in Uganda, that's where our source of the Nile is. So when we integrate what we have to offer, when we put together a good offer, we can actually have a growing tourism industry. What is missing is the issue of cooperation, collaboration amongst the countries that are involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaluba. And I am sure UNECA has taken note of our next meeting venue. At this point in time, I will invite Mr. Manik, who will share with us the experience of Mauritius in as far as collaborating with landlocked and land-linked countries in pursuit of mutual benefit in the blue economy. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Bon après-midi, boa tarde, alasiri nzuri. It is a pleasure to be home. But it is also a pleasure to be welcoming all of you here. I'll be talking about the experience of the Mauritius Africa Fund in developing projects on the African continent and how we have set about doing it by keeping in mind the benefits that can be accrued from our investments to landlocked and land-linked countries. To begin with, a compelling component of the Africa strategy of Mauritius is the setting up of special economic zones in joint venture with designated partner countries on the continent. The institution that I lead, the Mauritius Africa Fund, on behalf of the government of Mauritius, is currently involved in the co-development of 4 special economic zones in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, and in Madagascar, each with their own specificities, but at the same time some commonalities. Taken together, these 4 SEZs represent upwards of $250 million of investment being channeled through Mauritius into these respective countries. The main thrust of the SEZ initiative for the countries concerned, and that includes Mauritius, is to spur economic development and growth through industrialization. The prevailing spirit is one of collaboration, mutual assistance, learning and sharing of experience, and is an example of South-South cooperation. In keeping with the theme of this panel, my intervention will mainly draw obviously on the SEZs in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana because they are linked to landlocked countries. Now, the immediate observation that can be made is that all 3 countries that I have mentioned are coastal countries that happen to boast some of the largest and busiest seaports on the continent. As such, consideration was given to the fact that these countries may have either better links to the international market or better historical trade relations. Looked at from a different angle, it can be argued that they were better, or they are better integrated to the blue economy sector compared to the landlocked countries in the hinterland. The second important consideration was that all these 3 countries belong to a customs union, and in the case of Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, they also belong to a monetary union. These countries, these coastal countries, could therefore position themselves as outposts or gateways for the neighboring landlocked countries. Taking these 2 considerations in tandem, therefore, the SEZs that we are developing become potentially linkage of interest between the landlocked countries and the rest of the world via the seaboard countries, with numerous spillover effects. I will touch on 4 main aspects, both from a conceptual and practical standpoint, on how these SEZs benefit neighboring landlocked countries in relation, of course, to the blue economy sector. First of all, we need to look at the structure of the SEZs. These SEZs in general have 2 defining features. They are geographically delimited areas, and they are covered by a special regime of incentives to facilitate investments, operations, and access to market. From the very outset, we set about conceiving these SEZs as an international space for globally competitive production, even though physically they're located in one country. And when I say international space, special consideration, special focus rather, is being given to enterprises from the neighboring countries. Local and regional enterprises are encouraged to set up in these zones. Taking the case of Senegal, for example, we are focusing on attracting enterprises from Mali to set up in the industrial park that we have in Senegal. And similarly, for the ones in Burkina Faso, in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, enterprises from Burkina Faso are being tapped so that they can join into the special economic zones. And the second thing, and this has been mentioned in previous discussions, is that the zones are being organized in clusters to leverage on advantages that can be derived from companies doing similar types or related types of activities in close proximity with each other. Apart from the manufacturing sector, our industrial park in Senegal has a textile cluster to establish a value chain for the transformation of cotton. It has an agro-processing cluster, again for agricultural produce, and it has a seafood processing cluster. As a result, sectors of activity that would have been otherwise inconceivable for enterprises in landlocked countries become more accessible to these enterprises. Similarly, products that require processing, conditioning, packaging, etc., for shipment from these coastal countries into the landlocked countries can be produced at lower costs. And seafood and agro-processing in Senegal, especially, are very important to Mali. I think the 95% of the commercial traffic of Mali transits through Senegal. And the proximity of our special economic zone to the port of Dakar, which is one of the main ports, the fourth largest port, if I'm not mistaken, the fourth largest port in Africa, and the proximity to the fishing port of Embo provides opportunities for linkages between enterprises in Senegal, in the hinterland, and in the landlocked countries to the ocean economy in the fisheries sector. At the same time, I think the port of Senegal opens up maritime routes that would have not been possible to enterprises in Mali. The same feature occurs in Côte d'Ivoire, in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana. In Ghana, we are located, the special economic zone that we're developing is located in Dawa, which is close to the port of Tema, and also close to the fishing hub of Pram Pram. And the connection between Dawa and Burkina Faso is pretty much a direct route straight up north from Dawa to Burkina Faso. And the idea in terms of strategic location, the idea was to be in a place where traffic can flow in both directions, essentially between the international market, transiting through the seaboard countries and into the landlocked countries. And this brings me to the second aspect, and this has been mentioned again. It is the centrality of logistics in the operations of operations and the success of the investments that we are undertaking into these special economic zones. We have, from the very outset, placed considerable emphasis on the necessity of having a proper multimodal logistics cluster within each and every special economic zone that we're developing. The zones cannot function if they are not properly linked to sources of raw materials which may not necessarily originate within the same country. And at the same time, obviously, now in the global economy, centers of production have to be integrated into the global supply and value chains. The ultimate objective of the logistics cluster, as we have envisioned, is to be able to link the different countries within the regional market, within the customs union, within the monetary union, so that goods, raw materials, and finished products can flow seamlessly. Now, some of these corridors within these regions already exist, but at the same time, there are challenges that have been mentioned variously. We are working with international institutions, namely the African Development Bank, in trying to facilitate cross-border trade between the countries in which we are operating, in which we're investing, and the neighboring countries. Cross-border trade facilitation, which allows goods from these countries, from the landlocked countries, to move towards markets, which increases the competitiveness of the enterprises operating along the entire value chain, and at the same time allows for the finished products to be competitive on the international market. At the same time, the way the special economic zones are structured, they allow for the development of new sectors of the economy, some of which are linked to the blue economy sector. And this is the third aspect of my intervention. The special economic zone that we're developing in Côte d'Ivoire has a strong focus on biotechnology. And we are focusing on attracting companies that operate in R&D, research and development, in marine and coastal research, because of the specificity of Côte d'Ivoire. As most people know, Abidjan has a very dense laguna system, and at the same time it has a fairly well-established fisheries sector. Through the incentivization of new enterprises in new and developing sectors of the economy, we want to be able to attract and channel investment into these emerging sectors, which can be beneficial for these African countries. They're far from the traditional sectors of fisheries. Case in point, in the special economic zone in Cote d'Ivoire, in the technology park, we have companies doing research on algae growth and development for the biotech and pharma industries with clients, huge established clients in the pharma industry in the US and in Europe. We're also looking at integrating other aspects of the blue economy, tourism, for example. Again, in the same biotechnology park, because of its proximity with the Laguna system and with the coast and with the beach, we have been able to attract development of an aqua park. Now, this gets into slightly into the leisure aspect of the blue economy sector, but we have not been exclusive. We've tried to tap and to realize value in every sector that we have been able to identify. And finally, a very quick point on how we are also harnessing new technologies for the development of the hinterland and of landlocked countries. I haven't heard any mention being made today of the use or the role that oceans play in communications. Based on our research, I think the figures that are usually floated around is that 70% of communications worldwide go through submarine cables. And we have identified an opportunity of using the technology park in Cote d'Ivoire to be able to offer fiber optic cable access to Burkina Faso through a company which is already established in the operations of submarine cable. And we think that by tapping into the different aspects and the different elements related to developmental economics, the investments that we're carrying out have the potential of driving new sectors of the economy, consolidating existing sectors of the economy for the mutual benefit of Mauritius, the seaboard countries, and the landlocked countries. And just to wrap up, our ambition down the line is to be able to develop the SEZs as a hub in a hub and spoke model, meaning that down the line we intend to have satellite SEZs in the neighboring landlocked countries that will be fully and seamlessly integrated with those that we already have in the coastal countries. These centers of production are being structured, the model is being developed, they're being structured to extract maximum economic gains at each and every stage of the value chain. And I think this also allows for beneficial arbitrage systems, mechanisms to be set up so that the enterprises, irrespective of whether they're operating in the coastal areas or in the coastal countries or in the hinterland, they're able to remain globally competitive for extended periods of time. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to thank also the organizers, particularly UNECA and the government of Mauritius, for giving me the opportunity to be present here in this panel and to participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manik. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had the interventions from the 5 panelists in their areas of specialties. And at this point in time, if you may indulge me and allow me to take a few comments, questions before we go for lunch. And maybe my first question would be to Mr. Smith, and on the role of regional transport infrastructure. A number of panelists touched on the challenges that we faced with in terms of cross-border trade and custom clearance processes. If you can touch on the importance or the role of regional transport infrastructure and other infrastructure, and also if there are any good lessons that you can share with us, in particular the Southern Africa. Yes, please.
Yeah, it's always better to talk about what you know best. So when Namibia became independent in 1990, one of the big challenges was that we were only linked to South Africa. We were not linked in terms of road infrastructure to all the other neighboring countries. So we had to develop that road infrastructure as number one. We are now in the process, we have already developed the railway up to Angola, but we still need to do the railway link up to Zambia and Botswana. So due to the fact that we are a small economy, big country, small economy, in terms of being a small population, we have to take it stage by stage. And then also with respect to the linkage to Zambia, specifically what was very critical there in terms of infrastructure was the fact that a bridge has to be built across the Zambezi, which was of course funded more on the Zambian side because it's just across the border. So those were critical infrastructure. And then of course you've got the softer ones in terms of the border infrastructure and so on. So for us really in terms of developing infrastructure was really a process that what was more strategic in terms of the road, but then also having a long-term perspective in place to develop other infrastructure over a period of time. But within all of this, we told ourselves as a country that it is not about creating value only for Namibia, but also creating value across the border. That was very critical for us because most of these economies that we are linked to, of course, they are much bigger economies than us. And to create sort of that balance in terms of value addition. And then, of course, as I started with my discussion earlier, that it's unknowingly the benefit, unknowingly the benefits of the blue economy. Thank you.
Thank you. May I open the opportunity to the floor? Take questions, comments. May we take Comesa, and then after Comesa, introduce yourself and pose a question. Let us try and also to be brief and straight to the point, either comment or question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I will be very, very brief. Let me first commend all our speakers. I think we got a lot of information on their specific areas of intervention. My quick comment is on interconnection of our different, ports, dry ports, and also other facilities, revenue authorities. We have been insisting on physical connection so far. We didn't put a lot of focus on soft connection, which is very, very important. This brings me to what we call trade facilitation using, digital integration. This is very, very critical because you can facilitate a physical connection, but we are still facing the same road blocks. You are still facing the same non-tariff barriers. And this brings me to the question raised by Zimbabwe to say, okay, if the continental market is consolidated, do we think that will be really integrated if we don't take into consideration the transport, infrastructure, physical, and also a soft infrastructure? Now, along the corridors, we should see if we have appropriate trade facilitation instruments. Let's take the truck. When you move goods from one port to a dry port in another country, we know that for the trucks, they can't move without third-party insurance in each country. Now, how to make sure that we facilitate the transport along the corridor without a lot of impediment in terms of trade facilitation. So I think we need to bring in the facilitation instrument to make sure that this interconnection is more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Mic here.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, panelists. I think it's been a very informative and comprehensive discussion and very fascinating area. My name is Ndoli Kalumia. I'm the country economist for Mauritius, based at the African Development Bank office in Pretoria. I've been at the bank now nearly 10 years, and ever since I joined the bank, the discussion around the development of the Lake Tanganyika ports has been on the table. We've obviously, as rightly mentioned by Mr. Ngubane, that we've funded feasibility studies. Actually, there have been several studies that we've seen come across through the bank. But now in terms of actually implementation, which is always the more challenging part, we're not seeing as much as we should be seeing. And that begs the question as to what it is. Yes, we know about the geopolitical situation in the region, but why is it that we're not able to draw in private sector investments, or much needed investments anyway, even on part of the government, into developing this critical region, especially for the more landlocked countries? I think we've gone, and the challenge now is more time we take to implement and to develop this region, those feasibility studies really become not as useful. So again, we've seen it. We've seen the African Development Bank in projects across the region where, if we're talking, for example, of the Nacala corridor, where we've been funding, whether it's port development, but also the road linkages there between Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique, which we think at the moment, there's been some success in that area. We've done the same in North Africa with projects in Morocco, linking Morocco with the hinterland. So the examples there where we've managed to draw in private investment, and we've seen through these consolidated infrastructure projects much needed socioeconomic development in those respective countries. Then briefly on the presentation by Mr. Manik on the Mauritius Africa Fund, indeed the bank is involved. The bank is involved in trying to enhance cross-border investments. I think what we also really focused on is a lot of the financial sector development, capital markets development that comes around these special economic zones. I think there's scope to deepen our markets. Obviously, a lot of potential for banks, leasing companies, insurance companies, to do more work around these special economic zones. Then the question that comes to mind again is these special economic zones. We're talking about improving livelihoods, job creation, basic job creation. I mean, yes, we want the high-end, innovation, but in these areas we're talking about basic job creation, the numbers of jobs created, whether it's as a direct or indirect link to these special economic zones, and really how we're demonstrating that we're improving the livelihoods, the basic livelihoods of the people around the special economic zones, but also, again, with linkages into the hinterland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, South Africa.
Yeah, I just thought that maybe there's just one or two issues I wanted to put forward on the blue economy itself, and it's got to do with the the African reality of its blue economy. Firstly, I think we are underestimating the size of the inland waterways that we have on the continent. And I'm saying this because just by mere size, if you take Tanganyika or any of the big lakes on the continent, you really are talking about a sea within a land area. They're much more than lakes or rivers. And I'll come to that issue. And secondly, is distances to the outlets, to the ocean-facing areas. And therefore, as we approach the ocean's economy, it will be false of us to only link it to the outlets that are ocean-facing. I'm saying that there is an economy, a blue economy within the inland waterways, which has its markets and consumption centers in the neighboring inland, call it landlocked countries. And therefore, it's not always about how to link that to the oceanic facing. It's also how to create an ecosystem that feeds on itself. Because just to move from the central part of our continent, either eastwards or westwards, you're talking about thousands of kilometers. We might earlier have taken the Indians and Africa as a comparison, but it's a false comparison. Africa is 9 times bigger than India. So we might have other things that looks like they're looking the same. But when it comes to distances, overcoming distance, it cannot be that the only markets we have are markets for international trade and forget about integrating and using the ocean's economy to drive out the poverty within the landlocked regions of our continent. And that's just one big issue that is a unique feature of the blue economy. Just by size of the inland waterways, 350,000 square kilometers of inland waterways, bigger than any other continent, let alone any other country. So our strategy must still be a blue economy that serves the existing markets within those areas and have a blue economy strategy that still links those to the international side. And I'm raising the issue of I'm sure my friend there, Mr. Smith, has raised the issues of the corridors. The last issue I want to raise here is shipping. In the blue economy, particularly in shipping, and I think UNECA need to look at this issue. Control of shipping value chain has nothing to do with access to a port. It's got everything to do with the control of the cargo that we're exporting. The export policy of countries, whether you're coastal or inland, at the moment, we're all exporting FOB. Swaziland is a good example of how an inland, call it landlocked country, could have been. But it's a land-linked country because there's enormous value when they export sugar. They use CIF. They arrange freight, they arrange finance, they arrange their own insurance. And therefore, they value add on their exports. But most of our countries are exporting FOB. But when we're importing CIF. We're importing cost of these things from other markets. They raise money there, they raise insurance there. So I think we need, coming to shipping in particular, we need to have a strategy that says who controls cargo, controls shipping. And therefore, there's no exclusion, whether you're ocean-facing or inland, so long as you have cargo to export. By the kind of policy that you use for export, you can then use logistics as a value add that benefits your financial sector, insurance sector, and your tax base. I just wanted to raise these issues because dealing with landlocked countries, we tend to lock them into a concept that they are so dependent simply because they're not ocean-facing, whereas some of the dependencies is the export policies that they're using on the cargoes that they are controlling. I thank you.
Thank you very much for the interventions. I have been reminded that our lunch is getting cold, so I don't want to be in trouble after the session. We have noted the comments, questions from COMESA, ADB, South Africa, and also COMESA, ADB, and South Africa. And I would encourage my panelists, that is Baben Kubane and the professor, to attend to the COMESA ones, and Mr. Kalibo and Mr. Manik to attend to the AFDB ones, and Mr. Kalibu to also touch on, I think, the intervention by South Africa. But they will do this during our lunch, where we will be now ensuring that we maximize on the time that we have. And on that note, I would like to thank you all for your patience and for listening. And may we take this time and thank our panelists for taking time and preparing for these interventions. I am not sure, Mr. Chairman, if you have announcement on the time when you should come back.
Yes, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now break for lunch, and we'll be back at 2:30 sharp, please. Because we have, after that, we are going to have a ministerial high-level roundtable. So we have to be in time so that we finish in time for ministers to take over. Okay, thank you.